and welcome to another World War I medicine video with me, Mr. Vaughan. Over the next few lessons, we're going to be looking at the advances and developments in treatment throughout the First World War. Now, this will be looking at a variety of things, but today we're going to be looking at the developments in treating infection, the growth of X-rays and the use of mobile X-ray vans, and also the revolutionary Thomas Splint. Today's pages in the booklet are 38 to 39, but before we get started, I've got a little activity to get us warmed up. This activity is called Keyword Scramble. Essentially, you've got a small Scrabble box table thing in your booklets on your screen here, and using that, I would like you to write as many keywords down as you can think from the topic and their definitions. Obviously, just like Scrabble, the highest score wins. So I'm going to allow you to pause here and crack on with this, and then I'll return in a second and we'll get moved on. Enjoy. Welcome back. So let's get introduced. So welcome back. Let's get started. So during the war, there were significant improvements to the treatment of injuries and ailments and wounds, possibly or mainly due to the sheer number of cases that were received by the RAMC, which gave them more chance to improve their expertise and experience. And secondly, because the army really pushed the RAMC to get soldiers as quickly returned to the front line and back fighting as possible. Because remember, this was a war of attrition, a total war, and every man counted. So over the next few lessons, we're going to be looking at the following treatments in detail. We're going to look at treatment of infections such as gas gangrene. We're going to look at the revolutionary Thomas Splint, as I mentioned. We're going to be looking at mobile X-rays. We're going to be looking at blood transfusions, plastic surgery, and also brain surgery. All of these were essential in saving many soldiers' lives. And funnily enough, 90% of soldiers survived the First World War. Now that is a real statistic to challenge the misconception of the First World War. When many of you were taught the First World War in Year 8 or Year 9 at your school, I'm sure a lot of you had the idea that that the First World War was just death, destruction, and awfulness. Well, 90% of soldiers survived. And the work of the RAMC and many of these developments and treatments probably played a crucial role in that. So let's move on. Firstly, we're going to talk about gas gangrene, okay, probably one of the most gruesome of conditions. And it was one of the main problems that faced soldiers and the RAMC. Now, gas gangrene, if you can remember, was a bacterial infection in the body that produced awful gas, as well as obviously the rotting and the eating away of your limbs where it usually was caught. It was particularly fatal, and if spread up the body, it could kill within days. Okay, it was very, very dangerous. Two questions to start us off. Now, this is based on stuff we've been doing recently, so to recap the knowledge that you've got already. So, one, what were the causes of gas gangrene? And secondly, why wasn't it possible to perform aseptic surgery in the RAPs, the regimental A posts, and dressing stations? Why was it really hard to do this? I'm going to pause for a second and allow you to answer this. Enjoy. Do you like my William the Conqueror mug that my mum got me? Absolute doll. Look at this. Wonderful. So, let's go through some answers. What were the causes of gas gangrene? Effectively, the bacteria in the soil. As we know, the Western Front was a particularly unhygienic and unsanitary place. There was rotting corpses, munitions in the ground, fertiliser, you name it, rats everywhere. And once any of this mud or anything that was in your clothing got into a wound, the chances of getting infection were incredibly high, which then caused gas gangrene. Why wasn't it possible to perform aseptic surgery? Now, we've talked about aseptic surgery before. That is the removal of all bacteria from the front line, from the surgery whatsoever, through the sterilisation of tools, the using of gowns, antiseptics to keep the air clean. It was impossible near the front line, simply because of its closeness to the front line. You know, an RAP was within 80 metres of the front line, and a dressing station beyond that up to 200 metres. It was too dangerous. There was no chance to keep the area clean and hygienic and sanitary. So therefore, those cases of gas gangrene were sent backwards towards casualty clearing stations and base hospitals at the start of the war. So I thought another little quick thing here to kind of get your knowledge going about what you remember so far, and also like using your initiative. Imagine you were a medical officer, and the soldiers arrived at your casualty clearing station where you work with a severe infection of the leg. There's already some signs of gas gangrene coming already. It's big, like pus and gas-filled boils around the infected area. Two questions: what are your options for his treatment? So what could you possibly do? And why does he need to be treated very quickly? So I'm going to pause again and allow you to have a go at answering them. So remember, you pause as well. Good luck. So let's go through some answers. What are his options for treatment? If you can remember from our earlier lessons, the options for treatment at the start of the war were pretty slim. Antibiotics didn't really exist. There was nothing at the present time that could get rid of it. The only answer was amputation. Secondly, pardon me. Secondly, why does he need to be treated quickly? Well, gangrene can spread. Once it spreads to those vital organs, there's a chance. Pardon me. There's a chance you're going to die. So we need to make sure that you are treated as quickly as possible. Moving on. So, moving on, we're going to look at the diary of Gunner B.C. Jones. Now, he was a member of the Royal Field Artillery and was wounded in the war. And we're going to look at how the treatment he received for gangrene and his wounds, what it tells us about the developments in the war. Okay, so have a little read through. This is a diary entry from B.C. Jones, who himself served, as we said. So have a little read through, and I'm going to read through too. Hopefully you pause there and have a read through. My turn to read through this. So, source A from the diary of B.C. Jones, 1950-60. Jones served with the Royal Field Artillery in France from 1950. 7th of December. A German shell hit the dugout of artillery. I remembered no more until I woke up in Bethune Casualty Clearing Station, where I find I've been severely wounded. Left hand blown off. Left arm ripped up 12 inches. Scalp wound 6 inches. Wound over side of knees 5 inches. Now, to put that into perspective, a ruler, this doesn't really show very well, a ruler that your standard A4 size ruler is about 12 to 13 inches. So if you think that the tear up someone's arm, that's essentially someone's whole arm gone. Okay. So, 9th of December. Operation on upper arm for gangrene successful. 12th of December. So 3 days after this. I remain here for 8 days. Then I'm removed to Saint Omer by hospital barge. Very comfortable. I am then removed by train to Etaples, and then sent to England on a hospital ship. Returned to Nottingham, where I'm from, where I'm in bed until the end of February. 3rd of June 1916, I'm eventually transferred to Brighton, where I'm operated on and re-amputated. Lastly, awaiting Roehampton for artificial limb. Okay, so this is the experience of B.C. Jones here, who suffered terrible wounds, to both his arm, knee, and head. Within 2 days, he's had an operation for gangrene, and that you think 2 days is all it's taken for gangrene to start infecting his wounds. And luckily, they've managed to operate on it, and then within 3 days, he's on his way back to England. He stays for 8 days in casualty clearing station, but then goes all the way back. So it does show that there is obviously some huge progress in his treatment. 2 questions for you. Well, as always, it's a bit of source utility practice here. So using a highlight in your booklets, highlight the wounds he received, which is easy. Highlight the treatment he received. And then there's 3 questions here for you. Why is this interview useful to historians studying gangrene? So, if you were a historian and you wanted to know about gangrene and its treatment and the effects of it, what can you learn from this piece of information, this diary here, this primary source from B. Jones? So explain to me why it's useful, and you could use a quote. I always recommend using a quote to back up why it's useful. Secondly, What does this system tell us about? What does this source, tell us about the chain of evacuation? What can we learn about the chain of evacuation from the Diary of E. Jones? And thirdly, how does the author, and we've talked about this before in the 3Cs, the creator of this source make it useful? And obviously for the creator, you get it up here, the caption. Okay, how does B. Jones as an author add to the utility, the usefulness of his source? Think about what he's written and why his perspective might make the source more useful. Obviously, you're going to need to pause to do this because it's going to take you a while. Good luck, and I'll see you in the next little section. So, you should have had an opportunity to go through these here, and I think that some of these are quite straightforward questions that you should be able to answer. If you have any concerns or you're unsure, please do not forget to either leave a comment on this Loom video or on Microsoft Teams or on Share My Homework. Lots of ways to contact if you need to. So let's have a look at how did they develop the treatment of gas gangrene? What did they do? Firstly, well, I should have really put this last. It's a last resort. Amputation. The final step, if there was no success in treating gas gangrene, was amputation. As you can see from these images here, it was actually a rather quick process. Now, those of you that have done medicine already, we know that actually you could get a leg off within 30 seconds. It's particularly quick. But by the end of the war, almost 250,000 soldiers had limbs amputated, and Queen Mary Hospital in Birmingham fit 26,000 artificial limbs by 1980, which is an incredible amount. Hopefully resaving the mobility of many of these soldiers. So amputation was a last resort. But there were two new methods that were tried. One, now apologies for the gruesome picture here, but I think sometimes you need to see what happened. So we've got something called wound excision or debridement. They mean the same thing. You can choose what you need. And essentially, this is cutting away at the dead and infected tissue around the wound. So on the left here, you can see this person's wound with all the gas gangrene and the infection doing it around it. What they did was they cut away all of the dead and infected tissue and around it too, to hopefully remove any of the infected tissue. And then they would try and clean it up, close it up as quickly as possible, and before that, obviously, remove any shrapnel bullets within the wound still. We still essentially use this method today. It's infection, but again, speed is of the essence. You need to work really quickly to get this done. Lastly, the Carol Dakin method. Now, I found it really hard to find some images or even a video to accompany this. Most antiseptics at the time were inefficient because, if you remember, an antiseptic is outside of the body, and infections like this, like gas gangrene, got inside the body. Okay, so by 1917, right towards the end of the war, the Carol Dakin method was developed, and it was probably the most effective solution despite its limitations. Now, essentially, as you can see from the image here, they put tubes into the wound where they would pump a sterilised salt solution. I say pump, they come through a drip. And as you can see from the image just here, and this would go in and hopefully flush out and wash out the infection. It was great, it was effective. However, the solution would only last 6 hours and then would need to be made again. And it was quite hard to make and to manufacture on a large scale, and especially if there was a lot of wounded and a lot of men with gas gangrene, as we know, it was hard to there wasn't enough to always provide ample supply to everyone. So whilst it was great, there wasn't enough of it and it was hard to supply. So, last question for the solutions to gas. Essentially, keys to success here, although I quite like this. What was essential in stopping the spread of infection with gas? Well, speed. Speed is always of the essence. And as we will see throughout many of the videos and the topics we study here, speed is key. The sooner that you can get a soldier treated and stop the spread of infection, the greater chance of survival and recovery, like this gentleman here. Okay, so I'm going to pause there before we move on to the next section. So, welcome back. We're going to look at leg injuries now. Now, At the start of the war, the chances of survival with a severe wound to your leg were incredibly low. Only 20% chance. So 1 in 5 men would survive this injury, and especially breaks to the femur, like we've got one here, this awful break here in the leg. The chance of that surviving that incredibly low. Obviously, with a broken bone, once the bone breaks and the shards and splinters of bone start poking, they will go into our arteries, and you could bleed out and die. Okay. So real concern here. One of the main problems as well was, for those of you that have broken limbs before or legs, which is I touchwood haven't, but I know it's a terrible thing, is that the current splint that they used at the start of the war didn't keep the leg straight. So when the leg was trying to heal, it wouldn't heal properly, and it wasn't like structured enough for the bone to heal, so the bone would move and obviously cause more damage to the leg. And this again explains why the chances of survival were so incredibly low. And this splint would be fitted sometimes in a dressing station, and soldiers would then be transported all the way back to a casualty clearing station to hopefully have surgery to treat them. But because of the poor quality of splint, most soldiers, by the time they got to the CCS, would have suffered considerable blood loss, shock, gangrene, which could lead to amputation. That's if they survived the journey. And if you think back to the ambulances that we saw, the horse ambulances and the motorised ambulances, the road wasn't exactly the most comfortable of rides. So if you think bouncing along with this really poor quality splint on, it's going to cause some serious damage to your leg and make things worse. So yeah, conditions weren't great until this wonderful invention, this absolutely amazing invention called the Thomas Splint. Okay, now I thought I'd get this wonderful BBC clip here because I just think it really explains the Thomas Splint, its great work. And there is a Thomas Splint itself in the middle of your screen. So let's just chuck my face out of the way for a second, and then we're going to get the video started. So enjoy.
So Richard, how would you have treated during the First World War with a very badly broken leg?
Basically, you'd use a Thomas Splint, and the way this works is by re-knitting the bones together and using something called traction.
If you break your leg very badly, the muscles around it pull the leg shorter and the bones overlap. Traction works by pulling the muscles back to allow the bones to be realigned. Stabilising broken bones like this saved lives during the war because it meant blood could be controlled and there was a better chance of keeping infection out. It looks very uncomfortable to use, is that right?
Yes, it's incredibly uncomfortable.
Maybe Zon should have a go.
Yeah, I think so.
Brilliant. All right then.
If you hold it straight.
Okay.
And we need to up through there.
It's pretty difficult doing this kind of thing if we imagine him in the trenches covered in mud like this, and presumably you'd be working with people shooting at us and shells landing around at the same time.
Yeah, you're starting to see how difficult medicine would be in the trenches. You can see why you don't even bother to wash your hands beforehand. The mud gets into everything.
So basically, as Richard's tightening there, this frame is now pushing in your groin, and the bones that are broken here will be being separated, and then they can grow back together normally. What's amazing is to see this being used in a replica of a World War I trench, and to think, I've used one of these in a modern emergency department. It's exactly the same thing. So how do you feel, Sand? Is it comfortable? It's not very comfortable for me, and it would be very painful if I really had a broken leg. But my leg is very well supported. It would also mean I'm much more likely to survive.
Thank you. So, 2 questions. Why were leg wounds to the femur so lethal? Well, they talked about that. The shattered bone could cause some serious damage. And secondly, how did it revolutionise? Well, as you could see, the leg was clearly secured and then could regrow properly, which meant there was a higher chance of survival. So, the Thomas Splint. It was invented by this very dapper-looking gentleman, Hugh Thomas, and this is a diagram, really, of what it looks like. It kept the leg straight so the bone healed in the correct position. It was insanely effective. And from December 1915, so within the second year of the war already, Soldiers, so medical officers and practitioners on the front line were trained how to use one, and this type of equipment completely flipped the number of the deaths around completely. So previously it was 20% chance of survival. Now it was 80% chance of survival due to this fantastic invention by Hugh Thomas, which we still, as they said in the video, use to this day. So those of you that may have broken your legs, or especially your femur, would have used this. Let's move on to some questions here. So, question 1, why did the environment mean the original splints used on soldiers didn't really work? And that links to what I said about ambulances, and think about the terrain of the land itself. And the last question, what proof do we have that the Thomas Splint was a success? So 2 questions for you. We're going to pause there. So, moving on. Our final part of the lesson is looking at mobile X-rays. Now, if you remember from our progress up to World War I lesson, X-rays had made some quite quick progress since their discovery. The work of William Röntgen and latterly Marie Curie. And by the First World War, we knew that there were some X-ray machines at large hospitals back in England. But during the war, there was some great work, again, led by Marie Curie here, to create portable, mobile X-ray vans and units. And this is a real photograph of one that existed called Victoria, which is from the Western Front. And we're going to have a look at what the impact of these were and whether they were accurate. So, X-rays were used from the start of the war to identify shrapnel and bullets within the body, and they obviously helped in surgery. The sooner you can get inside the body and remove the metal, the fragment, or anything like that, or even fix the broken bone, you've got an increased chance of survival. Also, an X-ray can pinpoint where the injury is. So if you've obviously got, like this gentleman here, a bullet which is passed near the lung, you know where to go get it out, you know where to go find it and get it out, rather than leaving it there to spread infection and increase the chance of death. During the war, 6 mobile vans were used on the British sector of the Western Front, like this cartoon on the left here, and they were amazingly used to save many soldiers' lives. And they were nicknamed Le Petit Curie, after Marie Curie, who created them. And yes, there were some positives, and there were obviously some negatives here. I'm going to leave these up for you to have a go, and I would like you to highlight the positives and negatives of mobile X-rays. So, pause here, off you go. So by now you should have had a chance to read through the positives and negatives and highlight them, and I'm going to really quickly talk through the answers here. So, positives, you could locate bullets and shrapnel within the body and remove them, and these 2 link together here. So because of the availability of mobile X-ray units, they could now move them to casualty clearing stations, and by 1916 almost all casualty clearing stations had an X-ray unit attached to them. So the sooner that someone could have an X-ray to find out what was wrong with them, the quicker the treatment, the higher the chance of survival. Okay, so which is amazing. Negatives though, it would take a while for the X-rays to work. They would overheat, and you could only use it once an hour. And if you think in the war, especially for example in the Somme, 58,000 casualties, sometimes these machines would be overloaded and they could not deal with it quickly. Secondly, mobile vans took a while to set up. You had to set them up, and the quality wasn't as great. Obviously, a base hospital, a static big X-ray machine could do really clear images. Mobile ones, not the greatest, and you couldn't always see everything. Okay, and that links to our final limitation, is that it couldn't detect everything. And sometimes, for example, yes, a bullet goes in the body, but a piece of clothing that also has bacteria on could also be in the body that's spreading bacteria and causing issues, and you couldn't see that clearly. So, yes, amazing progress, helped save loads of lives, but not perfect. Okay, so last little activity of our little lesson today, looking at some social utility. Now, this is from one of the books that I saw, and it's a photograph of a mobile X-ray unit from 1917, so later in the war. And as you can see, the unit has certainly developed. It looks higher quality than the first ones we saw. Our question, imagine if this was a source utility one, what is useful about this photograph in telling us about mobile X-ray units? So if you have a good study of that photograph, what can we see that tells us about mobile X-ray units and how they were used? And the caption itself is a photograph of an X-ray unit. So I'm going to pause here. I'd like you to have a look at the example in your booklet, or if you haven't got a booklet, make some notes down, and then I'm going to talk about the answers. So good luck. So let's have a look at some of the answers to this final one. So what is useful about this source? Now I've picked three things apart. One, it highlights the complex nature of setting up an X-ray unit. You know, this doesn't look like the speedy thing where you could just open the doors, boom, ready to go. Not happening. It would take a while, and if you think X-rays are have fragile because of parts of glass and metal electronics in them, it shows that this photograph shows they were not a quick, easy thing to set up, which we do know from our own knowledge. Two, it's useful as it's from 1917, and I know that by this time most casualty clearing stations had a unit like this attached to them. So this could be a photograph, and in the background here there could be a casualty clearing station, and this is attached to it. So it's useful as I know, using knowledge here, that this could be from a casualty clearing station. And thirdly, it's useful as it shows a new technique. You know, we can learn that the army is trialling, well, the RAMC is trialling new methods closer to the front line, which meant the chances of survival were much greater. So we are done for today's lesson. As always, do the Microsoft Forms quiz for this lesson. That's attached to the team. And thank you, and see you in the next one. Cheers.